Well, thank you so much for joining us. As promised, the Politics Desk has been conducting a number of interviews with leaders of various political parties, whether it be at a national level, provincial or regional level. And of course, this is as we head to the local government polls, which are expected to be in November, yet a date has not been set. But I just want to bring your attention to this. Late January, early February, you might have seen the EFF there holding its second plenum following the third National People's Assemblies. And of course, one of the decisions that came out was that perhaps the EFF withdraw from all cooperation agreements with the ANC in all Gauteng municipalities. And joining me right now is the EFF's Gauteng Chairperson, Mr. Nkululeko Dunga, who will expand more on this. Thank you so much for making time to talk to us.
Well, thank you for having us, Natasha, and greetings to the viewers of the SABC News.
I think perhaps let's just start there as a parting shot. The EFF has said that they want to stop all cooperation agreements with the ANC in Gauteng. I don't know if you've seen the interview, but the Deputy President of the ANC yesterday, Paul Mashatile, spoke to our political editor, Mr. Nkosindipile, and he expressed his concerns over the matter. I know that the Secretary General has reached out to the EFF. At this point, can you just please tell us what is the current state of negotiations with the ANC, and will they actually try to dissuade you from this decision?
No, thanks. Well, the first point that would obviously like to express as the economic freedom fighters would be that we're not in this position as a result of a hardened approach by the economic freedom fighters, nor is it the current expressions that are expressed in society, well, by a fraction or by a corner of society and the ANC itself that attributes arrogance towards the position of the EFF, that is very far from the truth. The honest truth is that the EFF, in the establishment of compositions of governance, whether we form part of it or not, we've always expressed our support for the establishment of governance and governance structures with the hope that it would obviously equate to service delivery. But in all of that must be a common understanding and a relationship based on respect. Respect of the EFF, regardless of how insignificant one might perceive it to be, So the EFF has obviously taken a posture to respond to the provocation of the arrogance of the ANC in this case, and we were able to draw reference to the arrogance in that we sit and then we establish what are core governance principles, particularly in Gauteng, and how we're going to move in terms of the establishment of governance. And when we have to effect those decisions, the ANC, regardless of the structure, because we can't isolate the regions to the province and to national, they are a unitary organization, is that they would then abscond without a lack of a better word from those particular decisions and those principles. And that's where we find ourselves in at this point. So the EFF has expressed itself. You would have seen in the city of Mogale, you would have seen in Ekurhuleni where there was a rejection of the adjustment budget. You would have seen as well with the withdrawal of the acceptance to form part of what is now tabled as a coalition government in the city of Ekurhuleni.
So basically it's confirmed you've pulled out of all cooperation agreements with the ANC.
We have definitely withdrawn our support directed to the ANC.
Okay. So what happens with the budget here in Gauteng? I understand MEC Lebogang Maile will be tabling a budget next month in March. Will you support it?
Well, we have made our intentions very clear, and we still remain at that point that we have withdrawn all participation in terms of the support base of the ANC and the establishment of its minority governments throughout, and that is inclusive of Gauteng.
You've also indicated in the city of Ekurhuleni you've pulled out following last week's reshuffling. You have no interest there whatsoever. You rather sit on the opposition benches as well.
Yeah, we withdrew our participation and our support, obviously, at a point when the Aloof Mayor would have announced some of our members into the executive committee, were then gracefully declined the invitation to form part of that governance and fully accepting the role of being opposition, because there was a lack of voice of the opposition, particularly in the city of Ekurhuleni and across all municipalities, by the way. In the absence of the EFF being in opposition, there's a lack of credibility in terms of what constitutes an alternative voice in some of the matters that are raised, and that's exactly what we have done. But you have also seen the ANC just imploding on itself, on its own, unprovoked, at the absence of the EFF, and it tells you that the problem was never the EFF, but was always internal dynamics of the ANC itself.
One would argue that as much as you're saying that the problem was never the EFF, I'm not so sure if you saw the interview that I had with the mayor and the chairperson of the ANC in Ekurhuleni, Dr. Nkosindipile Xhakaza. He basically says he reshuffled your members due to a problem of non-performance, dating back also to your time as the MMC of Finance, that you didn't perform in the city of Ekurhuleni. How do you respond to those claims made by him?
Yeah, well, look, the mayor suffers from very high levels of low self-esteem. That's the first point. Some of the main issues that would always have a fight or a battle with is that there are programs that get undertaken by members of the mayoral committee. They would initiate programs, and you'd always have a problem as to why he's not forming part of those programs. If you are to thoroughly engage into the departments that the EFF was heading at the time, even at the time when we were still consumed in the Office of Finance, there you would have realized that there would have been many programs that would have been undertaken in those particular departments, and there's not a single mention of ANC-led departments where they would have initiated programs. Commissar Thembi Msane, who was heading water, would have programs such as to unblock drainages and to commission reservoirs and so forth, And the ANC at the time would actually drum up support of some level of members of communities to go and protest against the unblocking of drains and so forth. And the mayor would come back and say, but why was I not invited? Why was I not told of this program? But they would have known, as hence they would have mobilized the structures of the ANC to oppose it. The same thing with waste as well. There would be a lot of grass cutting. We actually stabilized what was an extremely dysfunctional department, and the EFF did extremely well there in that space to stabilize particularly waste collection in townships. The DA in the inception, when the EFF took control of the department, were the first people to complain that now there are suddenly trucks that are going into townships and collecting waste. We really did well in terms of commissioning and completing in some of the projects in terms of human settlements, as well as expediting the process of issuing out title deeds. And the mayor had a problem with it. He always wanted to see himself in a poster, by the way. When you are issuing out title deeds, and he would have a problem when he sees a red overall of a member of the mayoral committee. Just of recently, what would have been problematic for us is that we told our public representatives of the EFF that we must do a back-to-school campaign, so Funda Ngengane. And all of our members of the mayoral committees, when engaged in that program, he wanted to halt that program on the basis that they were occupied with a program of back-to-school of provincial government of Matume. And we could not allow that because our public representatives are still deployed by the EFF, and they still have to the highest and the greatest levels of respect to the organization, carry out the instruction of the organization. But the members of the ANC in terms of the mayoral committee are non-existent. They are not there. The Department of Community
Even the new ones that came in
collapsed.
right now?
Definitely. I mean, he has shifted the MMC of energy from one department to the other. The guy does not even have a license, but he's now an MMC of community safety. During his tenure in the Department of Energy, there was no commissioning of new substations. There was incomplete projects. He has never uttered a word inside that council to express himself in terms of the department, but has been contained and retained on the basis that it feeds off to the factional alignments within the ANC. We have called off the former MMC of safety, and we're happy that she's actually gotten fired because she had tried to influence, by the way, at one point in time, the tender contract by having a meeting with the service providers and even soliciting some monies from them and even a bottle of Hennessy. You know, we called those things off as the EFF, but nothing was done, nothing was changed. The MMC of Corporate and Shared Services, you know, as well, underperforming. Continuously, our reports in terms of the HR process are always returned. That's the highest level of incompetence. The Department of Legal under him has collapsed. You know, EPMO is not functioning, and risk is probably the only department that is just trying to salvage some level of credibility in that particular department. Was retained for the longest of times until, I presume so, until his voice recording of soliciting some sexual relation with the junior staff member actually came out, which then forced the mayor to actually remove him. And the same thing can be said even with the Department of Finance now. You know, when the EFF commanded that particular department, we're the first people to call out the Auditor General for the non-submission of the annual financial statements that were audited. We still sit today, 3 months after the deadline that is imposed on us by legislation,
but
particularly
there were also accusations
MFMA.
that you didn't perform well as the MMC of Finance during your tenure, hence that's why you were removed.
Which part of it? Because the one part he says that we were arrogant and were bullies, and at no point does he draw reference to exactly what is he speaking of in terms of the key performance indicators of the department we would have transgressed on. By the way, if I was an MMC at the time of finance and I was underperforming, why did the ANC accept the current city manager, who was then a CFO of the very same department that we were overseeing, to actually run the city? Okay,
Dunga, plainly put, if the ANC comes back to you and says, listen, we want this thing to work, because, I mean, it's not only the deputy president who has said that. I was speaking to Hope Babo, you know, from the ANC's Gauteng PTT. What conditions will you put on the table for you guys to actually go back into that cooperation agreement?
Well, the main point is to ensure that the policies and the ideological perspective of the EFF finds a resonance in governance. That's the first point. You know, in every part of the aspect of us having wanted to form part of co-governance would have been the pointers of the EFF that they would have tabled, such as ensure that there is insourcing of services, security guards and cleaners as one of the fundamental points, and really just engage in that process that speaks to the ideological perspective of the organization. But we're at a point where we do not believe that the ANC has any integrity to actually sit down with the EFF and its leadership to genuinely just compound. Xhakaza must just resign in the interest of social justice to the people of Ekurhuleni, in the interest of stability, because you collapse what would have been ordinarily a thoroughly functioning municipality that has a majority, you know, even in council, particularly in the city of Ekurhuleni, that has been functioning extremely well, and you would want to express your ego by trying and ultimately creating instability into the state. There's no way that we can form part of that governance in itself, you know. So Ivulamlomo, the president, spoke about at some stage as well, and to express as well what would be the initiating point at this point where we find ourselves in now, is that Xhakaza must go.
Okay. We've seen various political parties fielding the mayoral candidates. In Ekurhuleni, it's Xolani Khumalo. When are we seeing the EFF say that Nkululeko Dunga is our mayoral candidate for Ekurhuleni?
Yeah, don't elevate a particular candidate over all the other ones. You know, all these political parties are obviously engaged in the internal process in itself, and the EFF finds itself at that particular level. Obviously, the organization would have pronounced that it seems that there's a current posture where the electorate or the electoral positioning would be that we must be fielding candidates towards the elections, and the EFF is seized with that particular discussion internally. And once the organization has, you know, overextended itself in terms of the discussions, the necessary structure would take that particular position and would be able to announce that without fear of favor.
Which is when?
The organization sits from time to time. The time frame of the elections are pretty much intense and they are pretty much long. The question we should be asking is, why isn't the Minister of Culture and the President not announcing the date of the elections? And I think that's what we should be seized with as a fundamental question. Then all these other matters in terms of who are the individuals that you would want to see contesting those particular spaces are at that time. We must not be seized or be obsessed with the individualization of politics in general.
And in terms of the EFF, I think your hopes and your expectations in terms of your performance this time around the 2026 local government elections?
We've pronounced on the year of victory or death. And given a choice, Gauteng has fully expressed itself that we choose victory. And what does victory mean? Victory means that we've got to firstly close the base of the votes of the EFF, maintain the votes of the EFF and thoroughly increase on those votes, because 2024 elections was not a friendly election for the EFF. We lost votes. There was introduction of new political parties, the reactionary organizations that society saw as an alternative. So we obviously have to carry out our message much more clearer across to society and to the people of Gauteng. And we have done extremely well in terms of that space. We have shown that there can be an alternative government outside of the ANC. You look at the city of Tshwane, you look at the composition of even the city of Mogale City as well. You look at, to a certain extent, even in Gauteng as well. The municipality was thoroughly functioning and it was effective. And more than being effective, it was delivering services to our people in the absence of the ANC being in charge of it.
So let's just say...
we are at a point where we have done what we could, and now is to bring the message across to members of society and to genuinely vote for the EFF, increase our public representatives and councils, and ultimately take over in majority in these councils, bring in ward councillors, because we are seized with that question of how to win ward elections as opposed to proportional representation.
So I mean, it's victory and death, or death, I beg your pardon. It's a do or die for the EFF. If you don't achieve your desired outcomes in Gauteng, will you take sole responsibility to a point where you even say, listen, maybe it's time that I step down as chair of the EFF?
Individuals would have to take account and take stock for their participation or lack of participation, for their effectiveness and lack thereof, in the deployments. And our term as well is coming to an end as the provincial command team. So after elections, we are seized with the process of obviously re-establishing structures to take us to a conference thereafter, So those are all things that will manifest itself. We are not hardened in positions or fixated in positions. Provided the EFF shines in society and provided there's someone wearing a beret leading the EFF, we're extremely confident in that there is a continued approach towards stability and the growth of the EFF.
The issue of Xolani Khumalo, you formally lodged a complaint, against him, asking that he be referred to the Council's Integrity and Ethics and Integrity Standing Committee over what you describe as a breach of privilege and contempt. They've just labeled it as politicking, saying that perhaps, you found your match in the city of Ekurhuleni. So what do you have to say to that?
Yeah, no, look, I'm no actor. And that we had tabled 2 letters of complaints to the speaker. One was against the councillor of the ANC in Tsakane, whom there is a case currently right now for having sold stands that belong to the state and has pocketed that money. That's the first one. That was then referred to ethics. But the second and the most fundamental one, which is problematic for us in terms of the response by the previous speaker, and we'll explain why it's problematic, was this particular one of this particular individual, and that is to say that there is a transgression, we table it, we bring it to the attention of the Speaker, and the Speaker decides that they will not defer this particular item to ethics for investigation, but rather let Council be the ones that direct this particular matter to go to ethics. That means that now Council must be seized with an engagement, a political engagement, and that is now playing to the theatrics of politics, which we're avoiding because there are systems in place to hold people to account. And we have accessed that particular space, as hence we would have tabled this particular report to the Speaker to deliberate and really just investigate. But they've brought it to the theatrics rather of Council, and we're still weighing out our options in terms of that discussion. But the reason why they would have done that, the reason why the ANC would have opted for that, was that they were still in negotiations, by the way, with the Action SA, and they would not want to be seen to be actually taking this particular report, which should find itself to ethics, and in their attempt to try and pacify, a relationship with Action SA, they opted to not table it then and submit it to Council for further deliberation.
Okay, I'm running out of time, but I just want to squeeze in probably 2 or 3 questions. You've been seeing what's happening at the Madlanga Commission. It's exposing a lot of rot that happened in the city of Ekurhuleni. Your take on what's been happening there?
No, look, we allow the law to take its course. And as and when we are seized with an opportunity to advance the argument of a corrupt-free government, we do so without fear or favor. Many of the senior officials that find themselves in appearing before the Madlanga Commission would have been appointees of the council in itself, but they've also were brought, before Council in terms of transgression as a result of the investigations that would have unfolded, particularly at the Madlanga Commission and even prior to that, So we were at no point would we support any wrongdoing, would always be at the forefront of supporting anything that seeks to redress corruption in itself. And it's unfortunate because when the EFF came in, and no one wants to say this, no one wants to mention it, is that at the inception of us coming into government, we're the ones who said that there are ghost employees here and therefore there must be some level of investigation and vetting. And that vetting took place, by the way. We're still yet, obviously, to await the report, but it was a continuation of the motion that would have been tabled by the EFF in terms of the investigation of particularly human resource in itself. And amongst many other things, so every time we do receive a report, you can go and check the records there. They speak highly of the EFF having been directly opposed to anything that speaks of corruption.
Okay, let me take you back to this issue. You've rubbished these claims before, the blue light saga. Just take us back. I don't know if you've spoken extensively about this issue, but I mean, why was a private civilian driving you around why was a private citizen, driving you around in a car that was allegedly illegally fitted with blue lights? And perhaps, do you have a relationship with Kat Madlala?
One, we do not have any relationship with Kat Madlala. We don't know him. We've never seen him. The closest that we've ever seen him is through the screens of the SABC when we were watching Madlanga Commission, and ad hoc, and that's just as far as it goes in terms of that. We, by the way, once more, as the EFF, when we once came into council. And it was the State of the City address and there were snipers all around. We're the first people to call out that there are snipers here. We don't feel safe here. We have learned at a later stage that was actually Kat Madlala security, But we're labeled as people who were disrupting the State of the City address then, when we called out this particular act. And people must take ownership and responsibility as well in terms of their acts, both the Democratic Alliance and Action SA as well as the ANC, for having introduced that particular aspect of unlawfulness in the city of Ekurhuleni.
We're just about to wrap up. You need to answer my question.
But coming back to the point, I was a member of the mayoral committee at the time. I obviously had access to being driven by the state in terms of the blue lights, but I can safely tell you that the car that I was in on that particular day had no blue light fitting at all. obviously the state car was following me behind it, and I had never used it, by the way. I was always using my own vehicle to drive. It's just on this particular day I had taken a lift, and I was on this particular vehicle, and we had a car accident. In actual fact, the car accident was as a result of someone else, you know. And
was the vehicle yours?
That investigation,
or did it belong to anybody else?
That investigation is still out, is still being investigated,
Okay.
with the driver of the person, actually the cause of the accident having run away from the scene, by the way. Until today, I know that the investigative officer is trying to look for this guy, and the white guy just keeps absconding.
But
even
the
from
car that
court.
you were in, was it yours? Did it belong to anybody who had contracts with people in Ekurhuleni?
No, the car was not mine. I was just in a vehicle catching a lift, and
With
I was
who?
headed back home. I was alone in the car with the driver, with the private driver.
But the car was not yours. Can you tell us whose car it was? And did that person have links to people in Ekurhuleni? Was he a service provider? What was he?
I wouldn't know at that point, but I had caught a lift with the driver, with the private driver, and I was on my way home.
Okay, well, we'll explore this issue later on.
But there were no
hopefully.
blue lights. I mean, the reports would have spoken to the effect. The car was actually removed by the EMPD on the scene in itself. So if there were blue lights, they would have identified them the very same next day. In actual fact, the people who leaked the information of this car that I was traveling in, as well as the perception that there might have been blue lights, were members of the EMPD at the time, you know. So there's nothing untoward. There were reports. I mean, Action SA took it to court. The ANC pronounced on it. They went to the South African Police Services, and we await even that particular report to come back.
Okay, and we'll wait for that report, I guess. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you so much for making time to sit down with me in this interview. Of course, that was the leader of the EFF in the Gauteng province talking about their decision. He says that they've withdrawn completely from any cooperation agreement with the ANC in Gauteng, and he says they won't be voting for that budget that MEC Maile will be tabling next month. He doesn't want to tell us yet if he'll be the mayoral candidate for the EFF in the city of Ekurhuleni, but these, of course, things that we are going to keep a close eye on as the SABC News politics team. With that said, it's back to you in studio.